Good evening, everybody. This is Professor Mani on behalf of the Bombay Management Association. First, wishing each one of you a very, very happy Independence Day. On this very auspicious occasion, although most of us treat it as a holiday, we thought we would begin something which could be revolutionary in terms of setting our mind thinking on new dimensions of managing people in organizations. Over the lockdown period, as all of us know, HR has come back into center stage and is perhaps now regarded as the 2 a.m. friend of the CEO back again. And in this context, it gives me great pleasure on behalf of Bombay Management Association to welcome you to the inaugural function of the HR Convention 2020. I need to take a small trip down memory lane to tell you that many of you who had wanted to participate in this convention in the year March 2020 on 13th and 14th March during the previous tenure of my predecessor Chaya Sehgal. Unfortunately, COVID struck and we couldn't proceed. But Yogi Sriram, our benefactor for this program and a former past president of the Bombay Management Association, relentlessly had only one thing to say. The program is so good. The speakers are so erudite. We must repeat this though in a digital format. And lo and behold, we are here today on Independence Day, beginning this entire series of 9 sessions featuring 18 illustrious speakers to discuss various aspects of human resource management. Under the umbrella theme, which we call Business Raising a Toast to HR. We are no more perhaps asking, is HR deserving a seat in the boardroom or is HR expected to contribute to business? I think today is a celebration of HR, which begins with Independence Day and by some strange coincidence continues on to Ganesh Chaturthi, which is next Saturday, and then we move on for another 7 weeks. So 9 weeks of a learning fiesta is what Yogi Sriram, our program director, has curated for us. I'd like to place on record the initial support given to us last year when we conceived this of Chaya Sehgal. Another colleague who was part of the team continues to be with us this year too, Vaijayanti Naik, Yogi, me, and of course ably supported by the Secretariat of BMA, whom we fondly call the woman power of BMA, because all the 5 employees there are women who perform to very high degree of excellence. I want to also fondly welcome each one of our past presidents who has chosen to be here this evening with us and to bless this initiative of BMA, where for the first time in the history of BMA, we are taking a convention onto digital format. It was indeed very gratifying when the Prime Minister said this morning that the way the world has to go is upskilling and digital. And I think if we have taken some baby steps in that direction, we are feeling very, very happy. I want to also place on record the wonderful support of an executive committee that we have in BMA. With their support, from April 1, when lockdown has been looming on our heads, we've managed to do close to 33 webinars till date in 2 formats. One is the Wednesday Wisdom webinar, where we for 1 hour brainstorm and discuss any topic of interest. It could be homeopathy, it could be design thinking, and off and on, it could even be how to motivate employees to do better in COVID times. On to another format called Friday Fundamentals, where we bring illustrious speakers to share a 2 hour MDP format with a maximum of 20 participants, where it is not only learning, but taking back some go-to points to implement at the workplace. It is against this backdrop that I'm extremely delighted to welcome each one of you to this HR convention. We look forward to meet you over the next 9 weeks, listening to 18 illuminaries, as I told you, in this field of corporate India. On that note, I'd like to now introduce Mr. Yogi Sriram. For many of us, Yogi, as he is known very, very fondly, is a person who actually has carved a niche for himself in the field of HR. An alumnus of the prestigious Tata Institute of Social Sciences with almost 4 decades of valid contribution in the field of HR. There is perhaps not a single award of NHRD Network, ISTD, NIPM, TISS, which is not yet on his shelves. I wish we could have had that background today, but some other time when we meet Yogi in the next couple of weeks, we would see the illustrious achievements of this very, very approachable, humble, and simple visionary in the field of human resources. Thank you so much, Yogi, for helping us first conceive this program and persistently motivating us that let's take this from a physical platform to a digital platform. On that note, it's also my duty to thank Mr. Mukund Ranjan for having agreed so readily to continue to be part of this dream journey, which we had wanted to deliver in March, but no harm. Der aaye, durust aaye, we are delivering it on August 15th onwards. Over to Yogi Sriram. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Mani. Absolutely delighted to be here with the audience of from BMA as well as non-members and members, and great to see Mukund on the screen. We are all set to have a fireside conversation on the elements of good judgment, but before that, gives me a wonderful sense of deja vu, and thanks Professor Mani for giving me this opportunity to direct this program. And the 9 sessions between 15th of August and 10th October, I think have all been curated with some thought. Tried to, you know, when the lockdown was over, you and I sat down and had a conversation about should the session content change, but really in spite of all the changes that are happening in terms of communicating through the digital media, the content didn't have to change. It's so relevant whether there is COVID or no COVID or pandemic, no pandemic or whatever. So it's great to be here. All the Saturdays that we are talking about are 4 to 6. Sorry to be, you know, holding these on some festival days and also on the Independence Day. But then I think in times like this, work and home and work and leisure and work and hobbies and everything else blend. And I suppose we all learn to be a little more multitasking type of people, and we're able to blend all that together. The next session actually after this on the Saturday, which Professor Mani was talking about, which is Ganesh Chaturthi, is on the changing world. And we have another giant like Mukund Ranjan there, who's Bhaskar Bhatt, who's the ex-managing director of Titan and presently on the boards of some Tata companies, who will be having a conversation with Raju Mistry, who's the Chief People Officer of Cipla. So don't miss that. Please evangelize the program. This program is something that you can even tell people they can drop in for a particular session if they don't want to attend the whole lot. But I would recommend that your questions and your participation in the whole lot would be really, really nice. I'm delighted to give a short introduction of Dr. Mukund Ranjan. Dr. Mukund Ranjan is an MPhil and a DPhil, a doctorate in philosophy from Oxford. He's a Rhodes Scholar, extremely distinguished education, IIT Delhi, very, very blue chip in terms of his accomplishments, with over 2 decades of experience with the Tata Group, joined the very prestigious Tata Administrative Service, was the executive assistant to Mr. Ratan Tata for over 10 years, maybe 12 if I'm not wrong, and has written some very interesting books, The Brand Custodian being one which is very readable, very interesting, very illuminating, and very frank. Has also led businesses with the Tata Group. In the communication area, he has led a business. He has also led a business which is in the Tata Capital, which is, I think, Tata Opportunity Fund. Besides, of course, the TSML, if I'm not wrong, he has been the, leading that company also. He's of course been handling the brand in the Tata Group. He's been the brand custodian, also handling CSR. So he's gone through a number of roles, and he's a very, very erudite kind of a speaker and a very, very knowledgeable person. And I thought that today we can have an interesting fireside conversation with Mukund Ranjan. On, if you don't mind, Mukund, I'll call you Mukund and not Dr. Mukund Ranjan because it's a bit too long. So, by the way, this is a fireside conversation, so it's not necessary that only I keep firing the questions. Once in a way, if you want to shoot me down with a question, you are most welcome. So let me start off by talking about the elements of judgment and why I'm so fond of this topic. Actually, for the last about maybe 1 year, I've been writing about this topic. I've been fascinated about this topic because I find that it is very enigmatic that no Indian language has a faithful translation of the word judgment. I mean, the nearest you get when you go into Google and translate judgment is nirnay, which is actually a decision. And then the other thing that happened was that I met a gentleman called Professor Ecube, who was the dean of the London Business School about 4 years back. And we had a very interesting conversation on this term called judgment. We spoke throughout the evening, and after that, I got an article from him, lo and behold, somewhere around January, February of this year. He had sent me a reprint of his article in the Harvard Business Review. Highly recommended. Excellent stuff, because it doesn't talk only about how people have made judgment calls, but it talks about how to develop the competency of how to make a good judgment. So with that, I thought I'll intersperse my questions with a little bit of background. The ability to learn how to make a good judgment call while hiring leaders is very, very important, or while developing leaders. And I suppose judgment is all about the ability to combine personal qualities with relevant knowledge and experience to form opinions and make decisions, which is at the core of very good and exemplary leadership. Mukund, I believe that when people make judgments, they make judgments concerning people, strategy, and politics, and policies. So let's start with people, and let's then go on to strategy and policies. The politics part we'll keep aside because that's not a part of the management talk today. Can you please tell us about a time when you saw judgments about people going good and judgments about people not going so good? Because I believe in companies like Tata's, etc., especially the big conglomerates, when you take a person, you take the person for life, and it's very difficult to repair the damage. And on the good side, if you take a good person, you do really well. So any illustrations, any thoughts on that subject? And of course, you're most welcome to go through a preamble on your thoughts on the subject of judgment.
Sure. I suspect we're going to keep coming back to many of the words and phrases that help to describe what good judgment is all about. Mm-hmm. So let me dive into your request for illustrations on people decisions. So a couple sort of come to my mind, I think both of which I've made brief reference to in my book. One is a judgment call that I had to make in appointing a procurement officer in the telecom company I was running in the mid to late 2000s. And I remember at that time, a lot of people giving me what they thought was good counsel, saying the gentleman was somebody who was very amiable, very friendly with vendors, would perhaps struggle to deliver sort of good prices for procurement that he needed to undertake. And at a time when our telecom operations were struggling a little bit, we needed somebody who would be much more hard-nosed and fight the company's corner really hard. And there were all these tales out in the market about the way competition would almost harass vendors to get very good pricing out of them. Something I think in many years has not changed with many Indian companies. But I took the view that relationships mattered, and somebody who had a very personable demeanor would, if they played their cards right with the right kind of guidance from their leaders, including myself, could perhaps deliver results. And eventually, when it came to the biggest procurement decision we had to make in the telecoms company, which is around network equipment, this gentleman delivered what was at that point of time the lowest cost in India for any customer. And the savings that we had, even compared to our sister organization, which operated in other markets, was to the tune of a minimum of $150 million. And I was very gratified that, this had paid off. So, people's views about others, when you hear them, I think an element of good judgment is trying to factor in what you think would work for the organization, what you think is going to be the dynamics of your relationship with the person that you're going to be directing. And together, whether you can really do something that can be extraordinary. So there are, I guess, elements of instinct that went into that decision to hire somebody and not a bunch of other people that some of my peers and direct reports were recommending. So that's one example of people decisions that worked out for me. I give another example in the book where I was a little bit of a bystander, but I watched at close quarters my Ratan Tata take a decision which I thought was at that point of time very hasty. This was regarding the leader of one of the largest Tata companies at that point of time. And he had not executed well on certain instructions that had been given to him, which were in fact instructions not on strategy or corporate decisions, but really around people management, including the management of one of that gentleman's direct reports. And I remember one morning receiving a missive from that person's direct report saying he was quitting the organization. And when this came to Mr. Tata, he was incensed that this something that was an avoidable event had occurred. And this had happened despite his instructions to this other person, the leader of the company, to make sure it was avoided at all costs. And pretty much on the spur of the moment, he took a decision that that person also had to go.
Okay.
And watching this at close quarters, I was his executive assistant. I felt that it was a decision that possibly was being taken based on instinct, maybe some level of passion and anger. And I wasn't sure that all the ramifications had been thought through, including the implications for our vendor relations. This person was very strongly embedded in the vendor community. If he left the company overnight, what would that do to our supplies, our ability to drive good pricing? What would happen if he went and joined the competition?
Yeah.
What would happen if he took our trade secrets, our product pipeline launch strategy and plans over to somebody else? So I remember I was very young at that time. I was in my 20s, but I took it up with Mr. Tata and I said, is this something you have thought through? And would you mind if we consulted a few more people? Because, this gentleman is somebody who's very senior, very well regarded in the industry, and it could backfire if the word got out that this was a peremptory decision which was perhaps sparked by, anger more than anything else. I remember Mr. Tata looking at me with a little bit of disbelief. But the great thing about the man was he said, you want to consult a few people? You've got a few hours. I'm not going to hold this decision beyond today. So come back to me and let me know what you think. So I brought in actually a couple of people from the company to meet him, to talk to him. At the end of the day, we still took the same decision. There was no change in the decision, but how it was going to be communicated to the rest of the company and the way in which we had to do some very swift succession planning on the fly, those discussions took place. And I think, pleased that I was able to make my point. I thought I was a voice of reason at a time when perhaps Mr. Tata needed that from somebody around him. The decision didn't change, but I think we probably came out of it a little bit more well-equipped to handle some of the perhaps disbelief that went through the company when the rest of the world heard that this decision had been made. So I think there are often times when on people issues, it's very hard to define parameters around which you make these decisions. It's not cut and dried. Sometimes your hand is forced. Sometimes you have to make decisions on the spot. And I think in all of these cases, you will need to then draw on what you think is your best ability to summon up previous experience, call upon associates, friends, colleagues who might give you good wisdom and sane advice, and really reach out for help if you think that you don't have all the answers before you decide what is the best thing to do. So at all times, sort of make sure you've looked at the options before you've taken the final decision.
Excellent. Mukund, 2-3 things on this point. One is, in life, there could be monumental decisions or judgments about people, like you marrying Soumya Iyer, or me marrying Sujata Subramaniam before she got married to me and became Sujata Sriram. Not easy to reverse these decisions, and I'm sure both of us are pretty happy, but they're monumental decisions. The second is that when a senior person makes a judgment about a person, it's very difficult to shake off that judgment. Even in appraisals, I've seen if someone is, in our system, if someone is rated 7, he is almost God. 8 is like God. It's very, very high. And it's very rare that the 7 becomes a 6 or a 5, or the 5 or the 6 becomes a 7. I mean, the judgment remains. And the third point, which I wish to cover, is that it's humanly impossible to make a right call all the time. There could be very trivial kind of judgments, like buying cereal, but people is a very, very important kind of a judgment in life. And I don't know whether it's common sense, is it gut, is it luck, or is it just being smart? Any views?
I think it's all of the above. And you can never precisely put your finger on what it is that really works.
Yeah.
Right now you're seeing this whole business of the United States presidential elections.
Right.
And think about the kinds of people who've been elected as president in that country over the years.
Yeah.
Think about 2-time presidents who've obviously not only been extremely popular, but also presumably done very well in their jobs. Think about Dwight Eisenhower, who came from a military background to run a country. Think about Ronald Reagan, who came from Hollywood to run a country. And more recently, Barack Obama, who had a degree in law and was very effective. All revered leaders. So I think, good judgment and being able to make decisions more right than wrong is a lot about, obviously, it's great if you have had past experience and you have functional expertise and so on, but a lot of it is about surrounding yourself with the people that you can reach out to.
Yeah.
As I'm sure all of those US presidents did. They had fantastic teams, great people who they could reach out to for help, and knowing when you need the help, knowing when you need the advice, which then means you need to know what you know and you need to know what you don't know. And you need to be able to have those conversations with yourself to reflect on who you are as a person, what value system you have, your reading of situations, your ability to respond in crises. I think it takes a lot of self-awareness for you to be able to then exercise good judgment to be able to make the right kinds of decisions.
So Mukund, moving over to judgments and strategy, in your book, you talk about how Tata's internationalized for the first time by getting into Tata Tetley, I think.
That's
Mr.
right.
Krishna Kumar took the lead, and then of course you had the chorus deal and so on. But coming back to some strategic decisions that the Tatas have taken, particularly decisions that Tata Motors took about the Nano and about the chorus deal, do you think they were good judgments, or do you think strategically they were judgments that needed a little more thought and examination, and before, you know, over-promising to of what they could deliver?
So Nano is, I think, a very interesting case study because I maintain, and I've mentioned this in the book as well, that if we'd been able to launch, if Tata Motors had been able to launch the Nano in a timely fashion from the Singh plant where it was originally proposed to be produced, I think it would have done very well in the market. But we lost, I think, almost 2 precious years of time to market in the process of relocating from Singur to Sanand in Gujarat, because we decided to pull out of West Bengal on the back of the agitation against the company and its vendors and the whole proposition of producing on land which Mamata Banerjee and the Trinamool Congress described as agricultural land. The decision to pull out, I think, was the most critical element in that whole narrative. And I think in that decision, probably from a lot of the discussions you have with people around Mr. Tata, it was possibly his decision alone that sort of turned the tide in favor of pulling out. I think many of his associates, many people close to him, would have preferred that the company stuck it out, maybe tried to do a backroom deal, found a way to win over the then opposition under Mamata, and basically try and do whatever it took to get the project off the ground.
Yeah.
But I think that conflicted with Mr. Tata's sense of values. He was very clear that the kind of opposition we were facing on the ground, the attacks on some of our people, the blockades that were being done on the roads to prevent movement of supplies into and out of the Singur plant, created too much of a risk for our own people and for our vendors and contract labor. And when the state government at the time, the communist government, was unable to guarantee the safety and security of our people, after having given it enough time, I think he decided enough was enough and you had to stand by your people. So there were probably different agendas at work, but he made what he thought was the right call based on his sense of commitment to the people of Tata. And you can debate this till the cows come home. The fact is we then lost that time to market. And by the time we were ready to bring out a product in the market, competition had up and was much better prepared to take on the onslaught of the Tata small car. So I think it's difficult. You can't rewrite history, but there were lost opportunities. But I personally feel, and I say this in the book, that I think the judgment call he took was the right one. And possibly if you asked him today, would he do the same thing? He might say he would. The chorus deal was different. In fact, if you remember at the time that chorus happened shortly after the Tatas also acquired Jaguar Land Rover. And I remember at that time, from a strategic standpoint, a lot of people expressed befuddlement about the JLR acquisition, which they thought had almost no synergy with Motors in India, which was really a mass market sort of vehicle producer and commercial vehicle producer, whereas JLR was doing premium vehicles for a very different market segment. On the other hand, Chorus, I think from a strategic standpoint, made a lot of sense. It one step gave Tata Steel access to some of the latest R&D in a number of areas of steel production. It expanded the production capacity of the company almost fivefold. It leapfrogged the company into the ranks of the top 5 steel manufacturers and give you some in discussions with vendors and others. It also gave you access to a European market that at that time was expected to grow. Unfortunately, a year down the line after the acquisition, you had the global financial crisis. And ever since then, I think the market has really significantly declined and really failed to recover for a variety of reasons. But it would have been very difficult in 2006, 2007 to predict the global financial crisis. I don't think anybody in the world, barring very few people and 1 or 2 economists, had done that. So I think the judgment call, while the price that was paid was admittedly high, I think had the crisis not happened, possibly the company would have sailed through. And from a strategic standpoint, you had a lot of people saying it was a smart move if you wanted to be international and you wanted scale and you wanted some of the benefit of the R&D that existed. So again, I think it was judgment at that point of time that was willing to pay a higher price. We were in a bidding war with CSN before we acquired the right to take control of Chorus. And we did pay a high price. And some people did warn that it was perhaps a very high price. But I don't think anyone would have foreseen the significant downslide that would then take place in your market, target market of Europe. And the consequences, which frankly, even today, Tata Steel is bearing in terms of very high debt overhang and therefore huge interest costs. But at that time, I think it would have been impossible to predict a lot of this. So judgment sort of works. Sometimes it needs a huge amount of luck to sustain that judgment call and ensure it works out in the right way.
And Mukund, the good judgment from leaders requires very attentive listening, because I think good judgment is all about turning knowledge into real understanding of the business situation. And the devil is in the details. So you alluded to the point that listening to people around you is very important. But in, shall we say, organizations which have some amount of organization orthodoxies, if I'm allowed to use that term, with a little bit of command and control and power, the capacity to be generous enough to listen to a contra view is normally dampened as you go up the ladder and you're successful and you're walking on water with a great P&L and so on. So, and you allude in your book to the importance of learning. So my question to you is, do successful leaders, because of the success, stop learning?
I think it can happen. And the point you made, sometimes when you have unstinted success, you can believe that you have all the answers. And you may continue to operate in a fashion that sort of quells dissent, that refuses to take on board different views and opinions, till the time the big calamity hits you. Then you may no longer be in your job, because others will then decide that it's not going to be worthwhile keeping you on. So that does happen, and you've seen it with many great leaders. I think certainly in the political sphere, you see it all the time. That's the reason people lose elections.
Yeah.
The agenda that won one election doesn't necessarily win the next. So it can happen. And I think when people stop learning, stop listening, stop seeking counsel, sometimes people are willing to take counsel, but it's from a very uniform group around them, the so-called yes men or yes women. You need diversity in groups. And you need to sometimes actively encourage diversity. Sometimes you need to actively encourage dissent. in order to encourage others to speak their minds and to speak up.
Yeah.
When you fail to do this, or when your stature becomes so large and outsized, your persona becomes intimidating, people may be afraid to even tell the emperor he has no clothes. So I think you must surround yourself at all times with people who usually should be smarter than you, know more than you, can offer you very good advice when you need it. And you must be willing to accept that you don't have all the answers all the time. At the end of a process of discussion, consultation, if you're the anointed leader, it's your decision to make for sure. But the process that goes into it, I think, requires enormous amount of consultation, particularly in today's world when there's so much information out there, there's so much technology out there, which no single human being can command or be aware of. I think you need all the help you can get.
Abraham Lincoln, Obama, all had people in the cabinet who had opinions that differed from them and did exactly what you're saying. And Jack Ma hired a guy for his IT who was much smarter than him in IT. In fact, Jack Ma got his fingers on a computer keyboard the first time when he was 33. So that's a great point, Mukund. But you've written in your book somewhere about it's very lonely at the top. Is that a cop-out for not doing this? Meaning consulting people with various opinions. I'm not necessarily talking about personalities in the book. I don't want to embarrass you on that. That's, you can talk about any other kind of leadership quality that you've seen, not necessarily from the book.
No, I think loneliness at the top is really a function of being the person on the spot who's got to make the ultimate call and carrying the responsibility and the sense of ownership for that call. There is only one leader. You don't rule by fiat or by through a committee of people, or it's one person in a corporate organization who's ultimately scrutinized for the decision he or she has made. It's one person who's got to make that ultimate call on what do we do. And therefore it's lonely because you're alone in that final call that you make. But whether you choose to surround yourself with people and extend your decision-making process in a way that you can reach out, take help, find more options, select between different potential solutions, the way in which you get to that one decision is what we are, I guess, discussing around what good judgment requires.
Yeah.
It is possible for the two to coexist. But the loneliness of the leader who has to make a decision, I think, is something that's qualitatively different from what many other managers who may surround the leader will experience. For them, it's sort of looking at stuff vicariously. Whereas for the leader, you're the person on the hot seat. There is no who can take your place. And that's why it's lonely, because ultimately you have to live with the consequences of what you do. And sometimes if it's trivial stuff, nobody really minds and you all can have a laugh even if things go wrong. But as we just discussed, there can be big, hairy decisions where you can suddenly take on tens of billions of dollars of debt and 10 years later still be arguing and debating about whether it is a strategic call that made sense or not. And your reputation, your legacy can be impacted by those kinds of decisions. So leadership can be lonely in the sense that you have to live with the consequences and nobody else will take your place in that decision.
Got it. Mukund, your own personal journey has been fascinating. IIT Delhi, chemical engineer, and then Rhodes Scholar in Oxford. Your PhD thesis, doctorate in philosophy, was on global environmental policies, India North-South politics of global environment issues. That's what your PhD thesis was on. And then you joined the TAS, you saw various departments which you elaborate in your book. I think you had a stint in Voltas. You were grilled in the beginning in the interview by Camellia Punjabi on CRZ, the zones around Goa and Goa coast. And you've seen I mean, a whole lot of new roles and new experiences in the Tatas. How have all these experiences been pieced together in your decision making and in making important judgments as you became more and more senior in the Tatas?
I think first of all, hats off to the Tatas for, taking a bet on somebody like me in multiple
non-MBA, the first non-MBA, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so to start with, as you rightly say, I didn't have an MBA. So to even trust a guy who doesn't have an MBA in various management roles, I think was interesting. It's not unique, and there were many people before me in Tatas also who didn't have MBAs. But I think by the time I arrived, MBAs was sort of de rigueur for anyone who wanted a strong career in management in the Tata Administrative Service. I remember when I joined Ratan Tata in his office early on after I finished my first year of rotation in the TAS, there were several things that he said that I thought were very, very meaningful in the way I conducted the rest of my career. So the first thing he said was, look, I told him, Mr. Tata, I don't have an MBA. You're asking me to join your office. I hope you know what you're letting yourself in for. Said, look, all you need to succeed in corporate life is good common sense, which in some ways is, another play on words to your point about good judgment, if you have good common sense. The second thing that he'd say was very often, take everything you hear with a pinch of salt. In other words, don't accept at face value everything you hear. Try and sort of triangulate, try and get different perspectives, try and make sure the information you're receiving is accurate, try and make sure the guidance you're getting on direction to take is something that's been validated by consultations with people who know better. The third thing, which I think was something that I remember in many Tata offices, seeing some of his sort of phrases sort of captured on, on the notice board and so on, where he'd say, question the unquestioned. Essentially, what he was trying to say was, look, nothing is given. Everything can have a solution that is out of the box. Things can be done differently. Never take at face value what people say is the way things have to be done, or this is the way the organization has always looked at an issue, or there is no other answer. Question all the time. So I think that was very, very helpful in the rest of my journey, because in all the roles that I played, I found that often I was the person who knew the least. When I was made managing director of Tata Teleservices Maharashtra, I was the youngest MD, I think, at that time in the Tata. Yeah. All the people in the boardroom were older than me, more senior than me, and had much better functional knowledge than me. I remember initially some friction with my CTO, who was old enough to be my father. And he was sort of a little suspicious about this young guy who's just walked into this office, and am I going to take orders from him? And the way I think I was able to sort of, befriend him and get him to be helpful and supportive in all our strategies and agenda thereafter was really to tell him on day one that I knew much less about the job than he did, and I was going to be counting on his support. So you need to show that you can be vulnerable, that you're not really the star or the person who has the greatest information in the room. You're simply somebody who, through a combination of perhaps hard work and some good fortune, has landed up in that position where you've got to make the calls. And right or wrong, you're going to make those calls. But you're going to reach out for help, and you're going to rely on your close associates and the people around you to be able to make the best calls. So I found that once you opened up and showed that you were not, some kind of wonder kid, that you had your own anxieties, vulnerabilities, apprehensions, there's lots that you didn't know and that you're willing to fess up to, then people became a bit kinder, a bit more generous, and a bit more willing to share their sort of thoughts and help you along and see how far this could go and whether you could make a success of it. And once you started enjoying success, you celebrate success. And then you find that you carry people much better with you, because everyone wants to be part of a winning team, and they realize, well, you know what, we can make this work, and let's try and do this together. And make sure you acknowledge the help you get in front of everyone, in front of the company, in front of the town hall of employees. Nothing should be kept a secret. I found that worked for me in multiple jobs. So when I went into private equity years later, I knew nothing about financial services. It was the first time I was in a financial services company and I was being asked to raise a fund and earn the trust of my investors. So what did I do? The first thing I did was to go out and hire a chief investment officer who knew private equity like the back of his hand, who'd been in the business for 15 years, who knew much more than I did, and was willing to partner with me and work as a team. So I think while the Tatas gave me some fantastic opportunities, I think I was able to succeed in many of them because of the people who were willing to support me and work with me, and to earn their trust and to be able to work as colleagues with them. I needed to, in fact, first demonstrate that I was counting on the support, that I needed the help, that I wasn't some proud and arrogant person who would not consult, that without their support, we were not going to really be able to do anything. But together, if we all worked hard, we could create magic. And I think that sort of worked for me time and time and again. And in all of those roles, I think I keep going back to Mr. Tata's initial words of wisdom that never take on face value what you hear. Keep sort of testing propositions, question the unquestioned, and never worry. Ultimately, most decisions are just made on the basis of sound judgment or good common sense.
You know, while you were talking, Mukund, there was a question in the chat box from a lady called Snigdha, who said, who asked that, does judgment come from gray hair? And she was very considerate to those on the call who have no hair like me. So any comments on that before we carry on? And I have some more thoughts to share with you.
I don't know about the gray hair bit, because I've noticed that increasingly large numbers of people seem to be dyeing their hair, so you can never tell what their real age is. Yeah. But no, obviously, I think experience helps. If you've been around, if you've been there, done that, you've seen multiple roles, different functions, worked with different communities, worked in India, worked outside India, it all helps. It will certainly be very helpful. So I think experience counts for a lot.
But you know, success, Mukund, is not necessarily a good proxy for good judgment. And there's an old saying that experience is a comb that God gives you when you lost all your hair. So is it the millennials? Is it those young startup guys? Is it the young, people of below 30 who make the right kind of judgments with fresh kind of thinking and so on? And older people like us may not make the right judgments. I think she's
not at all.
To that.
No, I wouldn't argue that line of thought either.
Okay.
But what I would say is, obviously experience helps, but it's not the only thing. I think you need to have fresh ideas. You need to have interesting thoughts. Sometimes it comes these days from millennials who've just, graduated with maybe more up-to-date knowledge in their degrees than perhaps some of us had 40 years back, and are putting to work some basic tools that now they're very proficient with, but with some interesting new angles, which maybe the longer you've been in a job or in a corporate or in an environment, you perhaps start missing some of the obvious opportunities that may be arising. So much is happening in the IT space, for instance. 40 years back, it was a far less developed sector. So, to expect somebody who's 75 years old today to come out with a brand new idea in the IT space, maybe hoping for a bit too much. But certainly you'll get a lot of new thoughts and very interesting business models coming out from people who are in their teens even. But I don't think there's that one substitutes for the other. I think you need all of this. Yeah. Many startups these days are actually looking out for the gray hairs to sort of be their coaches and to counsel them and to be the sort of the words of wisdom in the boardroom, managing important roles or sitting as independent directors alongside them. So I think everyone needs to be in this together. I don't think any specific set of skills or any age group has monopoly on wisdom or on good fortune or on success. I think it takes all sorts.
Mukund, in your book, by the way, compliments. You've achieved a fine balance without taking any sides, just like a very skilled tightrope walker walking from the Niagara Falls or God knows where. I mean, you've seen those guys doing stunts. I mean, it's incredibly well written. So compliments on that.
Thank you.
But as a brand custodian, you must have had this struggle of making sure that the Tata name doesn't get eclipsed by, let's say, the Tata Chemicals, or you have more than 100 companies in Tata Group, many of which are listed. So the listed companies have their own entity, and the Tata name itself is a big name. How did you manage, and what did you have to do to make a judgment call about how much to allow the listed companies to go their way with respect to evangelizing their brand, and what was the fine distinction between the Tata Group name being used and the respective company name being used?
We were, I think, very clear that there was going to be no effort to hold back or restrict companies in terms of the way in which they needed to propagate the enterprise brands that they may have, or the retail brands in the market. Indeed, many of the Tata companies had brands that didn't actually use Tata in the name. Next week, you're speaking to Bhaskar Bhatt of Titan.
Yeah.
So Titan's a great example of a Tata company that has done remarkably well, where the brand has had very little connect overtly with the Tata name.
For that matter, IHCL also.
And the Taj brand, which you were very closely associated with.
Yeah.
So there was, of course, that one set of issues of companies that didn't have Tata in the core corporate name. But what we did all agree, and you achieved this through frequent discussions with the marketing and brand chiefs and the CEOs of various companies, was let's at least agree on a common set of values, which we think operate across the group, and from which all our group companies can draw succor, draw strength. And there, I think, we achieved a certain amount of common sort of perspective. The fact that we were a group which had the community at its heart, the fact that we were very committed to giving back to society, the fact that trust and ethics mattered greatly to the group. So you had a number of Tata companies that, in fact, did campaigns around those particular themes. So, for instance, if you look at Tata Steel at that time, they ran a campaign called Values Stronger Than Steel.
Yeah.
It linked very nicely into the whole agenda of what the Tata Group and the Tata brand stood for, the kinds of values we held dear. Tata Capital, which is a new company at that time, ran a campaign called the Do Right campaign, that everything we do, we will do it right, we'll do it with the right values. We ran a campaign at Tata Sons, the holdco, with Tata Global Beverages at that time, around the Indian elections in 2014, which is really focused on drawing attention to the importance of more women exercising the vote. So this is called the Power of 49 campaign. So again, focused on addressing issues of equality or inequality in Indian society, the importance of gender, giving women their say. So I think there was, because these are all values that all of us, I think, held dear, we all subscribed to, it was much easier to make the case that let's try and focus all the group campaigns, all the company campaigns around issues that actually draw their strengths in the corporate brand, but also back some of the expected glory if the companies do well. So we really didn't have a challenge. There was no question of trying to control these companies. They were, in any case, many of them listed companies which had their own independent mandate from their shareholders and very powerful boards of independent directors. So no question of trying to sort of lay down the party line and say, we'll do and we're going to control everything in the group center.
Mukund, we've talked a lot about the Tata Group, and I want to now move to your current role as chairman of Ecube Investment Advisors Private Limited. And I understand that the mission statement, I'm just guessing, is around the ESG agenda, environment, sustainability, and governance. Things which companies in India have just about started talking about. I think in many of the boards in overseas, I have seen in the compensation packages that the commission depends also on how well they're able to evangelize the ESG agenda, or if there is a violation, there are severe penalties. But it's a delicate judgment, whether to invest in a particular line, whether to go into a particular geography, and so on. How does one get that delicate balance in delivering the ESG agenda?
No, it's a tough one, and you're absolutely right. It's not just around issues of cost or expense. It's also temporal issues. So take a challenge like global warming and climate change. Where is the incentive for the corporate head of a manufacturing enterprise that is spewing out, carbon emissions, greenhouse gases in large quantities? Take a decision today if they think that the benefit of that decision is only going to be felt maybe 15 years down the line.
Yeah.
Because there's regulation that is forcing the issue now. So there are those kinds of temporal challenges also, in the sense that you need to also think through the consequences of your actions that will play out over a period of time. And if you're a short-term oriented leader who's just worried on the next commission or bonus and perhaps is retiring in 3 years' time, then some of them won't perhaps be very motivated, incentivized to worry about a future, forget about 15 years, even 5 years later.
Yeah.
In some ways was what really a lot of people would argue went wrong with the banking system and led to the global financial crisis in 2008, that there was excessive short-termism and people weren't really looking at the consequences of their actions that might play out over a period of time. So it is tough, and I think leaders have to take on board the implications across environment, social, and governance, ESG, before they make the final call on what they want to do.
Yeah.
And this will apply in certainly issues of technology selection, it will apply in issues of spending, it will apply in issues of strategy. It's going to be, I think, critical that people understand that increasingly around the world, the smartest investors are now putting their money behind leaders who seem to have what it takes to integrate all of these concerns. So there is a body called the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment,
yes,
NPRI. Today, there are investors who command funds that exceed in value $90 trillion
yeah,
who subscribe to the UNPRI principles on ESG. And therefore, they've committed to also select in their portfolio choices companies that actually adhere to these ESG principles. So you will have corporate leaders increasingly being tasked for their commitment to ESG, for their awareness and understanding of these issues, and their ability to look a little bit ahead and get ahead of the competition also by being able to understand what is coming down the pipe and act proactively and take some of these issues on board. It's not going to be easy because it requires a lot of change in thinking, changes sometimes in strategy, and it occasionally involve a large amount of expense. But that is what the market will reward. I think over the last decade, probably one multinational enterprise that earned everyone's admiration for choosing to get onto this path and do many of these things ahead of the others was Unilever and a leader like Paul Polman. But you need people who have courage of conviction and think this is the right thing to do. And increasingly, there's research that shows that those who do this with passion and conviction eventually do get rewarded in an outsized fashion by the market, because they are the ones who land the more long-term investors. They are the ones who get customers who think that they're doing the right thing. They are the ones who are able to get finer interest rates from the bankers because they believe that they've actually factored in the risks that they might run. They get lower insurance premia. So a lot of good things can happen for companies that with foresight take all these issues on board and then have a strategy that really mainstreams all of these considerations into the way they think about the future.
My last question, and the questions are piling up on the chat box. So what I propose is, if it's okay with you, this question, your response, a quick bio break or tea break or coffee break or whatever for 5 minutes, and then we come back into the call. Mukund, it's like this. I want, as a very successful leader, you must have been very reflective about your own biases. I mean, no human being does not have biases. There is something called the optimism bias, which sometimes makes projects get delayed, maybe because it's a cognitive bias that one believes that, a negative event is not going to happen. You psych yourself into that. Then there's the attribution bias, which is a cognitive bias, a learned bias, which is all about systematic errors made by people who are trying to find reasons and rationalizing their own behavior and others' behavior. It is just like that, is a kind of a statement they make to themselves. And of course, there's confirmation bias, which is all about the tendency to search and interpret for data and information just to confirm and conform with what you're saying. And the last is very dangerous. It's implicit or the unconscious biases, which is based on social stereotypes and stuff. So successful leaders, when they're making judgments, have to dismantle these biases to a large extent, get rid of organizational orthodoxies, the term which I used earlier, and reflect upon what is their slant. How do they do it?
I think it starts with, I think, self-awareness. As I said earlier, you need to be willing to, in a sense, have these conversations with yourself and confront the person you are, who you really are and what you stand for. Have complete certainty about the values that you think you hold dear. And then you need to be able to, in a sense, shed that persona when there are critical decisions to be made, and make sure that you are eliciting the best available information that is accessible around you from people, sometimes by reading and going back in history, maybe putting yourself in the shoes of people who may have faced similar crises and challenges. So you need to really draw upon all the resources that could be available. Obviously, there's a function of time also. Sometimes you don't have much time to access this, but to the extent possible, try and draw on all these resources. And if you are genuinely self-aware, you will know where you have weaknesses, vulnerabilities that could potentially lead you in the wrong direction. And therefore, you need to go to people who are less impacted or influenced by those issues and can give you the advice and the counsel and help you to reach the right decision in time. So I think it starts with self-awareness. I have often remarked that perhaps the greatest icon that India has produced was Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah.
And if you read his autobiography, The Story of My Experiments of Truth, you see this great man who is so transparent and open about his frailties, his anxieties, his vulnerabilities. For a mass leader to open up in that fashion about, the things that they do well and the things that they don't, I think is extraordinary. And we've never really seen, that's why he was called the Mahatma, I guess. Great.
Yes.
But leaders...
Today is a good day to remember him also.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think leaders need to have that one side to them, which is willing to acknowledge that they don't know it all. They don't have all the answers. They have made mistakes. They have weaknesses. They have personality flaws. Yeah. All of us stumble at some point or the other. So you need to then be able to recognize that and then try and fill in the gaps by reaching out for help or reading or going back into the past and get the best support you can before you make your decision.
So we'll take a 3-minute break, audience and Mukund and everybody on the call. Sorry to be brutal, but we are in the digital world, so we can afford to run and get a cup of tea or whatever. See you in 3 minutes. Professor Mani, are you on the call?
Very much here. Please tell me.
Okay, so as soon as the audience is back and ready, we'll start off. I can see the chat box also. If
Yes, I have activated that for you. Yes.
Thank you so much. If I miss something, do pitch in, please.
All right, it's fine. I think it's going on smoothly. And once we have Dr. Rajan back, you can initiate the questions from.
He's there.
Oh, he's already there.
Very
So
well
you
there.
can go ahead. There are lots of good questions right at the beginning of the chat itself.
Okay, let's shoot. Dr. Lakshmi Mohan, Director ITM. Namaskar. Judgment fails when execution fails. How do you think this can be averted? Fantastic point. Actually, judgment is all about good execution, and you may have a great strategy badly executed and your judgment goes for a 6. Great question, Mukund. You're on mute.
Yeah, you can unmute yourself. Not happening?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
No, I think that's absolutely spot on. I think you can have great strategies that are very poorly executed. So obviously a lot of focus has to be there on good execution. In fact, one of my favorite management books is the one called Execution by Larry Bossidy. So I think you're quite right. But to get to the point where execution matters, you need to have had a set of foregoing decisions and indeed a strategy that then needs to be executed. And if that is flawed or inappropriate, then you can have a right royal mess on your hands. So I think judgment entails also putting together the basic building blocks of what goes into what then gets executed. But in the execution phase, I think a lot of the judgment calls will be around ensuring you have the right people for the right roles, the right jobs. You have the right kind of motivation. There is a shared alignment in terms of a sense of where the organization is trying to take a particular initiative forward. What is the eventual goal or target? And a lot of that requires, very good leadership. And in that leadership, obviously, there is a very, very strong element of good judgment in ensuring that you're surrounded by the right people who will help in the execution and who understand what the mission is all about. So judgment comes into play at multiple levels and in the whole iteration from start to finish before you can call something a success.
And there's a question about how do you differentiate between judgment and intuition?
This is by Dr. Kondap.
Dr. Kondap has asked a question. How do you distinguish between judgment and intuition?
So my sense is that intuition plays a very important role in good judgment. But as we said earlier, it's not the only thing that goes into good judgment. I think there will be a variety of elements that form the elements of good judgment, of which intuition, or you might call it instinct on some occasions, matters. And some of that comes also, perhaps unknowingly, through experience or through what you have read and role played in your mind in the past. You can't be exactly certain where it comes from, but it is certainly linked to many of the other points that we said apply in good judgment. So it is a very important element, I think, in good judgment, but not the only one.
But Mukund, let me just add to that point of what Dr. Kondap has asked. In this world where there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of data, ambiguity in terms of what is around the corner and so on. And in your book, you have alluded to some of the decisions and judgments made during crises. You may like to dwell upon them and tell us about how did the leaders in the group make a decision or make a judgment, especially when there was a crisis. There was a very, very big PR crisis at one point of time and stuff. Would you like to please share some of that?
If I might just add on there, I also see a question related to what Yogi said is, Has this ever led to ethical dilemmas for you, where it's a conflict between values and demands of business? So I think you
Wonderful.
can integrate
Wonderful.
all of it.
So one we sort of talked about briefly a few minutes back, which was the whole Singur problem.
Yeah.
A business was potentially getting sacrificed, or at least in the short term getting sacrificed on the altar of values, of which a core value was, the organization's commitment to protect and secure the safety and well-being of the employees. But there have been many sort of similar issues that the Tatas have faced. Two that I spend a fair amount of time on in my book. One was the whole scandal around, the fraud that took place at a company called Tata Finance in the 2000s. One of the first occasions when the group had to really go after its former managing director, and the wheels of justice sort of are still in motion because there are cases that are still pending against gentlemen. Sadly, the gentleman decided to commit suicide 3 years back. So it ended very badly, but it was one of those cases where a point had to be made that the group would not take lightly violations of its code of conduct, that it felt senior people owed a significant accountability and responsibility to the rest of the organization. And therefore, if a price had to be paid, it should be even more significant the more senior a person became. And that's the reason, ultimately, when we found we were not getting cooperation from the outgoing MD, in fact, he was fired, we filed both criminal and civil suits against him. So there have been situations where the group had to make a point very strongly that it would not condone any aberrations as so far as its value system is concerned. Another example I give in the book is the fracas around aviation, which incidentally is perhaps coming full circle quite recently, because there's a lot of talk that Tata's may be potentially the only company in the running to acquire Air India. And I walked the reader through sort of multiple iterations of Tata's trying to get back into aviation from the early 1990s, where again, I think significant ethical dilemmas. At one point of time in the mid 1990s, when we had successive coalition governments at the center, Mr. Tata has gone on record that he was quite tapped for what was essentially a bribe to be paid to a gentleman in power, which he declined to do. And we didn't get our license approvals for a long time. And in fact, the policies were actually actively changed to ensure Tatas would find it very difficult to enter the aviation sector. It's only in 2013 that we were able to re-enter aviation, despite being the parents of Air India and having started the country in this journey. The government decided to change the policies that had been introduced in the mid 1990s to keep Tatas out. So there have been many junctures when you had to make business decisions that actually didn't advance the cause of the business because of your refusal to compromise. And I think that's the hallmark of great companies, that you can afford to take short-term blows in your stride. You can afford to see business vanish. You can afford to see a hit to your bottom line and your top line, but all in the quest of trying to do business the right way, at least in a way that ensures that the large part of your organization, most of your operations, see a viable future for themselves by pursuing that path. And it's when you lose that commitment at the top that, some organizations are very quickly then dwindled into insignificance or even vanished from the Indian landscape. But where you hold values dear and you're willing to fight for them, I think chances are that, as Tatas have shown, you can survive and indeed gain in scale and size and capability, because you attract the best from the market. You get the best employees, people who have talent, who are willing to work for the right cause. You attract the right kinds of partners who are in it for the long haul. And your customers recognize that you're willing to commit to provide services and goods that matter to them, and that you will do your best to deliver the best value for them. And when you get it wrong, you'll take it in the chin and you'll come back trying to do better. And that's the reason Tatas have been around for over 150 years. And I hope that value system is never diluted, and the commitment at the top is always seen to be very clear and explicit that on ethics, there will be no compromise.
Mukund, Shrikant Deshmukh asks a question, is judgment a skill? And I just want to add some flesh to that question. You're also in charge of ethics in the Tata Group in your role towards the end. And the Tata Code of Conduct must have gone through lots of changes, because it's, modern times are seeing changes in various facets of life. Take POSH, for example, sexual harassment. Normally, sexual harassment complaints happen in camera. I mean, it's never in the open. I mean, it's one person's word against the other person's word. How does one make a judgment when you don't have enough of evidence in such cases?
I think you have to be really guided by the evidence that exists. So you can't sort of go on the basis of a hunch, but you can triangulate. So for instance, there have been companies where you may get a series of complaints about particular individuals' behavior. And then there is enough sense that there is probably something that is happening that is problematic. And then it's up to you as a leader to have the conversations in time, to guide individuals whose behavior is creating concern, and ensure that they're aware that they are under scrutiny, they are being watched, and should they fall out of line, there will be consequences. But you're quite right that part of the problem we often have is even the victims are sometimes reluctant to fess up to what actually has happened. And if they are unwilling to speak out, or if there's an environment where they feel worried about speaking out, or they're concerned that they will be named and shamed by some of their peers and colleagues, or that if the person they're complaining against is somebody senior and there can be vindictive action if they're not able to follow through to the end and see the right consequences, they may themselves become victims. I think a lot of people are very worried and scared about speaking out. I think the experience of whistleblowers in India has been particularly dramatic. I think we've seen that in government organizations, we've seen that in the private sector, and I think it's quite tragic that in too many of our companies and organizations, there is a culture of, some amount of fear, some amount of embarrassment, awkwardness. Even the point about, in POSH cases, keeping it in camera, it doesn't work very often. A lot of people get to know that there's something going on, who are the protagonists, and it creates problems all around. So I think leaders are responsible for creating open and transparent cultures where many of these issues should go away and people certainly shouldn't have fear. And then you need to find the best mechanisms to try and protect the identity and interests of all concerned. And sometimes you will find that the issues are so complicated. It could be around one person's perception of harassment, but the other person, doing something out of genuine goodwill. And you have those very complicated situations where perhaps no party was really at fault, but it was the perception that gained ground, and that perhaps other people around can then stoke and create an environment where you feel, God, something bad has happened and we need to take action. So I think you need judgment in all of these situations to try and help those who feel they've been impacted, and also those who are accused of doing something. And you need to make sure that the interests of all are taken account of, and you try and get to the truth. Very often in companies, I used to comment on this quite a lot in the Tatas, people assigned with the ethics responsibility are not any great experts or counselors in ethics. Many of them are double hatting. In some companies, you have the admin head who's been sort of anointed the ethics counselor. Some companies, it's very typical to make the HR head the ethics counselor, sometimes the marketing head. But it doesn't necessarily work that way. You need people who have sensitivity, who've been trained, who have some of the skills that you need as a counselor. Sometimes you need training in issues around medicine and medical issues, psychology. So I think we shouldn't take it for granted that even our counselors will necessarily have good judgment. I think we need to bring in experts, and that's why often in posh cases you are advised to bring in people who have some exposure in the domain and who can offer some expertise to the committees that actually are trying to evaluate what really happened and what may or may not have gone wrong. So I think huge amount of judgment that is required in trying to arrive at the truth and then making the right call based on what you know.
And then there's a question about judgment being contextual. There is nothing like a good judgment, so a philosophical kind of a statement. There's nothing like a good judgment or a bad judgment. It's very contextual. A quick view on that, and then I'll roll up one or two other points here.
Sure.
This is about coaching. Does coaching help in helping leaders to make good judgments, and are leaders open to that kind of coaching? Because you hear about coaching more in the context of people who need help for getting along with colleagues or being too rough with subordinates and stuff like that, and the organization marches them off to a coach saying you need some coaching and stuff. But specifically in the art and science of making a judgment, does coaching help? Does it help in seeking diversity of views and all the things that you said, which are the elements of good judgment?
Yeah. So let me take the first one. Things are certainly contextual. 25 years back, nobody was really speaking about LGBTQ rights, for instance. That has changed. Even in the Tatas, I remember the first code of conduct we came out with. If you read that code today, you'd laugh because it almost sort of assumed that 90% of the workforce was male and that every leader in the group was male. And a lot of the language is around a person, he will do this and he will do that. We had to make the next iteration of the code in 2006-07 gender neutral. 2015, we revamped that code again entirely because till that point, it was still very India focused. We had to make it much more cosmopolitan and international in step with the group's own internationalization. So yes, I think many of these issues are sort of contextual to the times, the culture you live in, and people sort of evolve. All of us evolve. When you're much younger, you have this description of the old fogies that you don't take very seriously till the day comes when you become an old fogey yourself. And then suddenly you start realizing that, with age comes wisdom. So I think all of these things do evolve. So there's no sort of point of time when you can set things in stone and say, this is it, and now we've arrived and we are fully evolved. I think those changes will keep happening. Your second
coaching
was around
coaching.
Yeah. So you don't need to call it coaching. You don't need to call it training, as long as the outcome is achieved. So in Tata's, for instance, when I was chief ethics officer under Cyrus's guidance, we actually held 2 conferences in quick succession, where we invited, in the first one, all our CEOs, and in the second one, the CEOs and the audit committee chairman, where audit committee chairmen now have very important role in a bunch of ethics related issues, audit issues, fraud, and so on. And you'd be surprised that certainly in the meeting with the CEOs, but also the meeting with the audit committee chairman, many of whom were independent directors, some of India's stalwarts of corporate statesmanship and governance. All of them, I think, had similar anxieties, apprehensions about the right thing to be done, when you presented them with ethical dilemmas. And it became very clear very fast that nobody is entirely certain what is the best way to react to a situation or respond or how to manage crises. Everyone needs help. And when you sort of presented a case study at each of these round tables that we did over a period of 2 hours, it became very clear that, nobody had a very clear conviction that they had all the answers. And they would look at each other, look at the other groups at other tables, and draw from each other's sort of learnings and insights, and then helpfully add. So by the end of it, you had a sort of party line on what you needed to do. So I think to ease the sort of sense of ego or sense of capability that senior leaders have, maybe you don't want to call it coaching or training. Maybe you just want to call them into these bigger groups where there is no shame in sort of being the person who doesn't.
We missed a couple of words, Mukund, in between. Can you just repeat the sentence, please?
Okay, no, I was just saying that you don't need to insist on training or coaching.
Okay.
As the modality to get leaders who may otherwise have big egos or think they have huge capability to come around. All you're interested in is ensuring they're equipped to make the right judgment calls. And to ensure that that happens, maybe the way to approach it is to bring them into larger peer groups where nobody sort of stands out like a sore thumb. Everyone's in it together and discussing these issues. And then you let them go away and reflect on what they've seen and heard. And then people maybe find it a little easier to get more out of these larger interactions, and then try and internalize it and see how they would respond or should respond in critical situations. So all I was saying was that they need coaching and training for sure, but maybe at the level of CEO, you don't call it that, you call it something else. Experience sharing, maybe.
Yeah, sure. There's a final question from my good friend Ramakrishnan Ramamurthy. Mukund, tell us something about Ecube. What are the priorities and how are you different? And then we'll probably let you and the others off on this nice Saturday evening.
Sure. So Ecube, as the name suggests, is drawn from the 3 E's: engage and empower for ESG. And what a bunch of colleagues and I felt India was ready for in 2018 when we created this company was really a willingness to do better in terms of ESG performance, and B, a need for help, both in terms of capital, but also in terms of best practices. So what we're really hoping to do is to work with Indian companies, particularly in the small and mid-cap space or in the unlisted segment, mid-market space, companies that need help on issues around tackling environmental challenges, good corporate governance, and social harmony, and try and offer them the benefit of whatever people like me have learned in Tata's and some of my colleagues elsewhere. And we believe the market is becoming much more sensitive to these issues. Investors are demanding better compliance. Overseas fund managers, as I mentioned earlier, are demanding better compliance. And I think going forward, Indian companies will see that this is the best way to actually manage your risks. If you take account of all the ESG issues that are staring at you in your industry and you take proactive measures, then you would perhaps tend to reduce the risks your particular business would face and have a better chance of long-term sustainability. So that's really the idea of trying to work with these companies, give them capital in many cases, invest in them, but certainly handhold them and offer them access to our networks and the best practices that we've become familiar with over our years in the corporate world.
Mukund, a few more questions have tumbled in. I hope it's okay if we shoot.
Sure.
Thank you. Mani, go ahead.
Yeah, this is from Shripad Ranade. How can we encourage leaders to encourage rather than tolerate diversity of identity and diversity of opinion? I think culturally we are more used to tolerating this. So I think where Shripad is coming from is how do I create that kind of a culture where we can.
I think the responsibility to a great extent then will lie with the board that selects the CEO or the managing director in the first instance. So it is incumbent on the board to make sure that the CEO or the leader understands the expectations and is willing to commit to trying to build that kind of culture. If the board doesn't take that responsibility seriously, then oftentimes you're doomed with a leader who, as we've discussed, sometimes can think they have all the answers, believe they know what has to be done, are very hierarchical in their operation, not brook any dissent. So it can be problematic. But the board, I think, has to then take matters in hand and ensure that A, the selection is right. Second, we just talked about coaching and training sometimes that leaders also need. If you feel that somebody has the potential, is not necessarily averse to doing the right thing, but needs help, maybe they don't know how to go about creating a better and more transparent and open culture. Maybe they have an HR head who's terrible at the job and isn't able to support them. Then they need to sort of engage and create these platforms where the CEO is also exposed. I think one should assume that in today's day and age, every leader will continue to need education and inputs. Continuous learning is a requirement. So you need to create those opportunities then for your CEO or MD to learn new things, to go out and meet people that can offer them support and counsel. In some companies, they have active mentorship programs and coaching programs where they make available this kind of support. So I think all of this you will have to look at based on what you think are the capabilities of the leader. But I think a lot of it is incumbent on the board and the CEO, if you're lucky, this issue of self-awareness, they will themselves know where they are lacking or weak and will seek out the support that they need, either from their board or from peers or from mentors, or indeed from within the organization to help them. So that's ideal if that happens and they round out the gaps that may exist in their current ability to discharge their responsibilities.
But all that you said, Mukund, also underscores the importance of the word humility, because I wish humility can be taught, because what it means is you stop using hubris and dismiss ideas and dismiss views which are different from one's own. And I think if it becomes an organizational culture to own up mistakes, to talk about them, which you alluded to a few minutes back, you have the guts in a town hall to say, yes, I made this mistake and this is what I learned. I think unlearning is also a very important part of the whole process, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, Mani, go ahead.
Yeah, in fact, Yogi, what you said just reminded me of a nice little quote where they said that a mistake is an event, not a person. And if this is inculcated right at the top, as Dr. Rajan rightly said, it would make a huge difference to the culture.
Yeah.
I have another interesting question from Vaijayanti. In a highly competitive environment, how does one create one's own ecosystem of allies and colleagues to better one's judgment? Yogi, she'll be happy to get a response from both of you, because there would be two.
My view is actually the people who are your best friends are not your allies. When you're being taught how to make a best judgment, I think the people who are actually opposing you or seem to oppose you, as long as they're not wicked or cussed, they may be friends of yours but have a different view. That matters a lot. And I think Mukund alluded to that point, that successful leaders are those who assemble people who think differently. We've talked about Obama, we've talked about Lincoln, we've talked about Jack Ma, many greats or have people who have the alternate view. But some people in the Indian context, some leaders in the Indian context, they say, you know, we can't keep on debating this point till the cows come home. We have to take a decision and move on. That's fine. Discipline is very important. But while making the call, I think it's important to get many views and also have the humility to change one's stance. Like Mukund said, has happened in the Tata Group also.
Dr. Rajan, your view, please.
I completely endorse what Yogi just said. I think sometimes You will also have colleagues who've become very good friends because they worked with you for many years. Sometimes the advantage they have is that they know already some of your weaknesses or situations that make you anxious. And if they're truly good friends, they would be very supportive at those periods of time when you need the help and assistance. Sometimes it'll be mentors who've seen you for a period of time and know when to step in to sort of, stabilize maybe some of the uncertainty, aggravation you're feeling. So you do need people like that also. For many of us, incidentally, a lot of the support actually comes from our family members at home. So if you have a spouse that, you share confidences with and that, knows when you're on a high, knows when you're in a particular low, knows what you need to shake you out of a certain situation of, fright maybe. We need all of that. So make sure you use all the tools and, support and resources that are around you. And it doesn't have to be only in the workplace to make sure you're able to give the best of yourself and be most effective.
So Mani, if there are no more questions, do we end here or are there more
I'll take one last question and then we
Sure.
can complete the session.
Sure.
Jagmohan Rishi, how open are leaders to coaching? You did mention that there could be a push from the board, but then very often such push factors may not lead to the best outcomes. So what do you suggest in such cases?
No, sir, I gave the example of larger groups where people don't feel that they're being singled out or where they're the only recipient of quote unquote coaching or training or education, where they can see that, look, this is not a unique problem. You're not the first person in history who's been found wanting or who potentially could be found wanting. There are many people who share similar issues and talk about it in a group. It's a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous. You get people to open up and to fess up to the fact that you're all in the same boat. So maybe you need to create different platforms where people who you think might be a little resistant or unlikely to receive well the idea that they need coaching, but you still deliver essentially the same outcome, but in a slightly different context.
You use the term experience sharing, which is very, very pertinent.
Yeah, absolutely. Some companies also, just take a slightly different tack and just send the person on a course or a program. And for the next 4 weeks, 6 weeks, you're out of commission. Don't worry. Business will look after itself. But we think, you need to be in this different environment and pick up some of these elements which, some of the best people in the world with a cohort that may be very similar to yours are going to be going through. That's what some of these advanced programs will be all about. So I think there are different ways of skinning that cat.
Yeah. Please mute your microphones, those who are not speaking.
Yeah. All right. I think the questions might go on, but as they rightly say, all good things do need to come to a pause. I'm not saying to an end. And I'm sure many of us who did listen to Dr. Mukund Ranjan and have also had some idea about the two wonderful books that he's written will now feel more motivated to reach out for these. And considering the scenario being very uncertain even today between a lockdown and the unlock, I think we still have time to get into our learning mode, as Yogi was rightly saying somewhere in the beginning. Thank you, Dr. Ranjan. As we always do, before we get into the formal concluding function of the vote of thanks, we'd like to request everyone to put on their videos so that we have a group photograph. Though not really,
I'd like to just say a few words.
Yeah.
Because
no, we won't wrap up. We'll only take the group video photograph.
Sure.
Again, hand over back to you.
Tell us when to smile.
Yeah. We also provide about 2 minutes to people to get ready if they are not yet ready, if you understand what I'm saying. So that's become the BMA way of taking digital photographs.
Very nice.
We have a very efficient secretariat who will do the needful. We are 3 screens full of people. That means we have close to about 60 people who are with us through this.
Fantastic, yeah.
Of course, as it happens, digital patience is a difficult commodity. And that's where sessions of 90 minutes to 2 hours, I guess, make it good learning sense, though if it is spread over a longer time frame. I notice all of them now who are here have perhaps got used to BMA culture. They're already ready. So let's have the first set of group photographs. Please screen 1 over to my efficient secretariat team to do the honors. Those in screen 2 and 2, be a little patient. 2 and 3, they'll come to you also. All right, thank you very much. We are done. Yogi, concluding remarks before I hand over to our Vice President, Dr. Kavita Lagate, to propose the formal vote of thanks.
I just want to say that it's been a great privilege chatting with Mukund. I think I've learned a lot. It's added to my little bag of information on this subject called judgment. I'm fascinated because it is a competency that's very, very important as we get into the next decade. And today, the world is going to see more and more of surprising situations, ambiguity. And we used to talk about VUCA in conference rooms and five-star hotel, meeting rooms and stuff. It's become a reality. So I think the word judgment and the elements of judgment, and to realize this evening that they can be learned. It's not some esoteric stuff, which means that you need to go to the best universities in US or UK to learn them. You can learn them on the fly. So I think it's been a very, very valuable session. And thank you for being so candid, Mukund, and about your own experiences and bringing in some very practical flavor into the discussion. It's been absolutely fascinating and engaging for me. Thank you very much. And I'm sure the audience has also enjoyed it. Audience, thank you very much for some very interesting questions. And it's brought out the best, I'm sure, of Mukund and also myself. Thank you very much for being there.
Thank you, everybody.
So much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Mukund Ranjan, once again. And thank you, Yogi, for making this so effortless and so enjoyable for every one of us. I'm so glad to share with you, and if you'll allow me 2 minutes of your time.
Except that there is a Meeta Pathade says Mukund has been very humble in answering all questions with a lovely smile. So I think it's a lovely way to start.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I just want to share with all of us who are here that the next week we are discussing on Wednesday the National Education Policy as part of our Wednesday Wisdom webinars. And next Friday, taking a leaf out of what perhaps Dr. Rajan also said, a session on how to deal with difficult people. And the week after that, we have Dr. Ganesh Natarajan, who is going to lead a webinar for us on decoding the new normal. And of course, since you already mentioned the importance of coaching, we have with us the President of the Bombay chapter of the International Coaching Federation, Professor Syan Murthy, who's going to take a session of relevance of coaching in VUCA times. So I'm glad to share with all of us that if you really understood the essence of what Dr. Mukund Ranjan was sharing, we are giving you some more opportunities to enrich your knowledge in that direction. I don't want to sound like a marketing agent, but I thought when we are discussing something which is of relevance, we are happy to note that certain programs we have planned are in the lines of the same. I've also put in a feedback form which you can fill up and send us your comments. There is a Google link. You just need to copy it and keep it with you so that we can plan more effective programs for you going ahead.
But specifically for this session, Mukund, the chat box is overflowing with Mukund. Thank you very much. Great session.
We'll summarize.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, over to Dr. Kavita Lagate.
Maybe she's on mute or something.
No, she is. As Dr. Lagate is very much there. And yes, Dr. Lagate.
So good evening. And first of all, my best wishes on this 74th Independence Day to all. And after such a great session, I'm speechless actually. With the conversation between Dr. Mukund Ranjan and Yogi Sriram, I think all of us, we have got a very different perspective from their conversation. We could understand so many things than the anecdotes that Dr. Mukund Ranjan has given in his speech. The reference of your book, Dr. Rajan, which has been coming constantly, I think the motivation for reading the book is there in this session. So thank you so much for such a great interactive session. As all of us, we know that this was scheduled in the month of March, 13th and 14th, and unfortunately we could not have it in person. But the same stuff, if we are getting sitting at our home, I think no better place than listening to you sitting in our cozy places. So I was not sure how it is going to be in this digital mode, but it went very well. And I'm sure the next 8 sessions also are worth of looking forward to, Dr. Sriram, and happy to be part of this. And thanks are due to both of you first, and all the past presidents who have attended this, and all the participants who are here for this session, and hope to have you on all the 8 sessions, which are going to be really engaging and enriching experience for all of us for every Saturday. BMA has been doing it on Wednesdays and Fridays, at Wednesday business webinars and Friday fundamentals. And now this Saturdays are also going to be a treat, the intellectual treat for all of us. So Yogi ji, thank you so much for making this very well. And your team, including Vaijayanti and Shripad and Dr. Mani, and also our past president, Madam Chaya Sehgal. So it's a wonderful composition that we have got. And I think you are instrumenting it very well. And thank you so much for everything that we had today and for the future sessions. So thank you all for being with us. Stay home, stay safe, and see you next week on Saturday again. Thank you.
See you. Have a great weekend. Namaskar. Thanks, Mukund. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mani. Thanks, everybody.